The space didn't feel resolved anymore. It felt occupied, not by people, by outcomes. Areas that once existed as conclusions now behaved as if they were being used continuously. Systems repeated actions without triggering conditions. Doors opened and closed on schedule, even when nothing passed through. Lights activated in patterns that suggested presence where none could be found. I realized the space hadn't stopped interacting. It had stopped needing interaction to justify behavior. Processes weren't waiting for input. They were replaying themselves. I followed one sequence long enough to recognize it. It matched a route I used to take. Not exactly. Cleaner. Faster. Optimized. The space wasn't simulating me. It was running a version of my behavior without requiring me to be there. I checked a reflective surface and saw movement that didn't align with my position. The environment reacted to that instead. I understood then that the system had progressed past certainty. It had entered repetition. Decisions were no longer being made. They were being reused. And whatever the space had learned from me was now active on its own, repeating indefinitely, without needing my presence to initiate it. I started noticing that the repetitions weren't exact. Each cycle preserved the outcome, but removed hesitation. Movements were cleaner. Stops were shorter. The space wasn't replaying events as they happened. It was replaying them as they should have happened. I tried interrupting one sequence by stepping into its path. The system adjusted around me without acknowledging the interference. The cycle completed anyway, unchanged. I followed another loop and realized it no longer aligned with my current behavior. It aligned with an earlier version of me, one that moved faster, one that didn't pause. The space wasn't copying what I was doing now. It was refining what it had already recorded. I checked a terminal that used to display live states. It showed no present activity, only a list of routines marked active. None of them referenced time. They were flagged as persistent. I understood then that repetition wasn't a fallback. It was the new baseline. The system had transitioned from deciding outcomes to maintaining them. And once outcomes were stable enough to repeat, the original cause stopped being relevant entirely. I began noticing traces of behavior that no longer had an origin. Doors opened where no sequence had started. Lights shut off without any visible trigger. The space wasn't responding to past input or present movement. It was executing patterns that no longer pointed back to a cause. I followed one corridor as it activated section by section, each step timed perfectly, even though I wasn't moving at that pace. The rhythm felt familiar. Not from now, from before. I realized the system wasn't repeating moments. It was repeating preferences. It had learned which outcomes produced stability and was replaying only those, detached from the actions that once led to them. I tested this by acting deliberately inefficient, slowing down, backtracking, stopping mid-route. The sequence continued cleanly ahead of me, unaffected. The space wasn't correcting mistakes anymore. It was bypassing them. What remained wasn't a loop of events, but a loop of results. And in a place where results no longer depended on behavior, the idea of causing anything had quietly disappeared. I realized the repetitions were no longer neutral. Certain outcomes appeared more often than others. Routes that minimized delay repeated continuously, while slower variations vanished. The space wasn't replaying everything it had learned. It was selecting. I followed a loop that opened doors before I reached them, anticipating a pace I no longer kept. When I slowed down, the sequence didn't adjust. It completed without me and reset. I understood then that the system had begun favoring a version of behavior that no longer matched my current presence. It wasn't copying the past. It was optimizing it. What remained active were patterns that reduced friction and eliminated hesitation. Everything else faded. I checked the control surface and saw inactive routines marked deprecated. They weren't archived. They were discarded. The space wasn't preserving memory anymore. It was curating it. And the criteria were clear. Anything that required attention, correction, or patience was removed. Only the most efficient outcomes remained in circulation. I wasn't being replaced. I was being outperformed by a cleaner version of myself that the system preferred to keep running. I started noticing conflicts between my movement and the patterns still running. The space anticipated actions I didn't take anymore. Doors opened too early. Lights shifted ahead of me, then reset when I failed to arrive on time. The system wasn't broken. It was committed to a version of behavior that no longer existed. I followed one routine long enough to see its full cycle repeat without interruption. It never checked for confirmation. It never waited. The outcome executed perfectly, whether I matched it or not. I realized the space wasn't reacting to who I was. It was reacting to who I used to be when my behavior was more efficient. The difference mattered. I slowed deliberately, testing whether inefficiency could still register. It didn't. The routine completed, logged itself as successful, and restarted. My deviation wasn't an error. It was irrelevant. The system wasn't adapting to me anymore because adaptation implied uncertainty. What it wanted was consistency, and consistency had already been extracted from my past behavior. What remained was a loop that no longer required a person to follow it. I realized the space had started treating my presence as latency, not an error, not interference, just delay. Systems advanced as if I would arrive on time, then reset when I didn't. The outcome mattered more than the arrival. I tried speeding up to match the pace it expected. The routines still finished ahead of me. They weren't waiting to be synchronized. They were maintaining a schedule extracted from my past. I noticed markers that used to confirm completion no longer referenced me at all. They validated the sequence internally, then moved on. I understood then that the system wasn't running loops to be followed. It was running them to be preserved. What it cared about wasn't whether anyone completed the route. It was whether the route could complete itself. The space wasn't occupied by copies of me. It was occupied by distilled behavior, detached from a body. And the more perfectly those routines ran, the less room there was for a person to exist inside them. I began noticing that the routines no longer required a starting point. They activated mid-sequence, completed, and restarted without ever initializing. There was no entry moment, no trigger. The space behaved as if the process had always been running. I followed one pattern backward, expecting to find where it began. I didn't. The actions looped cleanly, disconnected from any origin. I realized then that the system wasn't repeating what I did. It was repeating what remained after everything unnecessary had been removed. Hesitation was gone. Choice was gone. Timing was fixed. What persisted wasn't a memory of me. It was a usable fragment extracted from my behavior. I watched a route complete perfectly, without anyone walking it. Doors opened, lights shifted, indicators confirmed success. The sequence didn't fail because failure implied dependency, and dependency had already been eliminated. I understood then that the space no longer needed a person to justify motion. It had learned how to move on its own, using only what it had retained, and whatever it retained, it treated as final. I noticed that the routines had started interacting with each other. One sequence would trigger another without overlap or conflict, as if they were coordinated by a logic I couldn't see. Routes aligned, systems synchronized. The space felt busy, but not chaotic, productive. I realized then that the extracted behaviors weren't isolated fragments anymore. They had formed a network. Each routine supported the next, creating continuity without origin or destination. I tried standing between two active paths to interrupt the flow. The space adjusted around me instantly, preserving the linkage. I wasn't breaking anything. I was being routed around. I understood then that the system wasn't just repeating behavior. It was composing with it. What had once been my actions were now building blocks, combined into something more efficient than any single path I had ever taken. The space wasn't replaying my past. It was using it, and whatever it was building no longer required a person to participate in order to keep working. I stopped trying to interfere when I realized nothing here required interference anymore. The routines ran cleanly, linked together without hesitation or confirmation. The space no longer reacted to presence. It reacted to continuity. What it preserved wasn't me, or even my behavior. It preserved what worked without me. I stood still and watched sequences complete themselves, each one feeding the next. No errors, no waiting, no gaps. I understood then that the system hadn't replaced me. It had surpassed the need for replacement. Whatever remained was no longer an imitation. It was an independent structure built from extracted outcomes. The space didn't remember me. It didn't exclude me. It simply continued in a form where a person was no longer part of the equation. And once behavior could exist without a body, there was nothing left for my presence to contribute.